In the small town of Riverton, nestled beside a dense forest, a group of old friends received a peculiar invitation. Each of them had once been close during their high school years, but time had drifted them apart. The invitation was signed by a mutual friend, Ethan, who had recently inherited his late uncle's secluded cabin in the woods. The message was simple: come for a weekend of fun and nostalgia at the cabin. Let's catch up like old times, Ethan. Despite their reservations, the group, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, and David, decided to go. Each felt a mix of excitement and unease, but they couldn't resist the pull of reconnecting with old friends and the promise of a weekend away from their routines. The friends arrived at the cabin late on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was charming but old, with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell. It stood at the edge of the forest, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Ethan welcomed them with a warm smile, but there was something off about him. He seemed distracted, almost distant. As the night fell, the group settled in, sharing stories and laughter around a roaring fireplace. However, the mood shifted when Ethan revealed that the cabin had a history. His uncle, a reclusive writer, had spent his final years there, working on a mysterious novel. Ethan mentioned that his uncle often spoke of the shadow, a dark presence in the woods that had haunted his dreams. Intrigued and a bit spooked by the story, the friends decided to explore the cabin. In the attic, they found a dusty old typewriter and stacks of unfinished manuscripts. One of the pages caught Lisa's eye. It was filled with frantic, disjointed writing about the shadow, described as a formless, malevolent entity that watched from the forest. That night, as the friends tried to sleep, they each experienced unsettling dreams. Sarah dreamt of dark figures lurking among the trees, whispering her name. Tom saw himself wandering lost in the woods, chased by a shadowy figure. Lisa dreamt of being suffocated by darkness, unable to scream. David's dream was the worst. He saw Ethan, but his eyes were empty, and he was mumbling about bringing them here. The next morning, the group gathered in the living room, sharing their strange dreams. Ethan was unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously to the window overlooking the forest. As the friends talked, they noticed something odd. Ethan's behavior seemed increasingly erratic. He kept looking at the forest, muttering about the shadow's hunger. Lisa, feeling uneasy, suggested they leave, but Ethan insisted they stay, saying they were safe as long as they stayed in the cabin. This only increased the group's anxiety. To distract themselves, they decided to explore the woods in daylight. The forest was dense and eerily silent, with sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy. As they ventured deeper, they found strange symbols carved into the trees and the remains of old, abandoned campsites. It felt like they were being watched. Suddenly, David screamed. The group rushed to find him standing over a freshly dug pit, inside of which lay a pile of animal bones. They were arranged in strange patterns, similar to the symbols on the trees. Panic set in as they realized the bones were not just of animals but also included human remains. As they hurried back to the cabin, they felt an oppressive presence closing in around them. The trees seemed to whisper, and shadows moved at the edge of their vision. They burst out of the forest, breathless and terrified, only to find Ethan standing on the porch, his eyes glazed over. Inside the cabin, the group confronted Ethan, demanding answers. He broke down, revealing that his uncle had been obsessed with the shadow, believing it to be an ancient entity that could grant immense power at a terrible cost. The shadow required a sacrifice, and his uncle had written about bringing people to the cabin as offerings. Ethan confessed that he hadn't believed the stories but started hearing the shadow's whispers after spending time in the cabin. It had driven him to invite his friends, hoping to resist the dark influence, but the shadow had twisted his mind. He showed them his uncle's journal, detailing a ritual to summon the shadow, which required the life force of unwilling participants. The friends realized they needed to leave immediately, but Ethan, now under the shadow's full control, blocked their way. He revealed that the shadow had promised to bring his uncle back to life if he completed the ritual with their sacrifice. In a desperate struggle, Tom and David managed to subdue Ethan, tying him up. They planned to escape at first light, believing they could make it to town and get help. However, as night fell, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The shadow seemed to close in on the cabin, its whispers filling the air. Just before dawn, the shadow made its presence known. The cabin shook, lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the rooms. The friends huddled together, clutching improvised weapons. Ethan, still tied up, began to laugh, his voice mingling with the shadow's whispers. As the shadow manifested, it took on a vague, shifting form, like a dark mist with tendrils reaching out. It seemed to force them towards the shadow, but David tackled him, struggling to keep him away from the others. Sarah, in a moment of clarity, remembered the journal's mention of fire as a purifying force. She grabbed a lantern and smashed it on the ground, setting the cabin ablaze. The flames quickly spread, forcing everyone outside. Outside, the shadow seemed to retreat from the growing flames, its whispers turning to angry hisses. Ethan, still under its influence, tried to run back into the cabin, shouting that he couldn't let it end this way. David grabbed him, pulling him back as the flames engulfed the building. As the sun rose, the shadow's presence faded with the light. The friends watched as the cabin burned, feeling the weight of their ordeal lift. Ethan, exhausted and disoriented, collapsed, mumbling apologies. Rescue came later that day. The group explained what happened, although they left out the supernatural elements, fearing no one would believe them. The authorities concluded that the bones in the pit were remnants of old, unreported crimes linked to Ethan's uncle, who had a dark history. Ethan was taken into custody, his mental state shattered. He kept talking about the shadow, insisting it was real and that it would come back. The friends, though deeply shaken, were relieved to be alive and free from the shadow's influence. Weeks later, Sarah, Tom, Lisa, and David met up to check on each other. They all agreed to move on with their lives, though the experience left a lasting impact. They avoided the woods and spoke little of what happened. But in Riverton, whispers continued about the shadow in the woods. Some said it was just a story, others believed it was real. The friends knew one thing for certain: they would never go back to the cabin, nor speak of the shadow again. The terror of that weekend would always be a shadow on their lives, a haunting memory of the unknown lurking in the depths of the forest.